Thank you everyone for joining us tonight for this very important webinar. Given that the elections is, going to finish at the end of this week, a lot of people have already been, going and doing voting in the pre-polls. So yeah, exciting times. So I'd first like to start with an acknowledgement of country. I'd like to acknowledge and pay my respects to the custodians of this land, elders past, present, and emerging. I acknowledge the many Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples who have made an important contribution to this land and community and continue to do so. This land is, was, and always will be Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander land. Warm welcome again, everyone. My name is Tarini Rouet, and I am the founder of Compel, which is the Center of Multicultural Political Engagement, Literacy and Leadership. According to the Human Rights Commission, 1 in 4 of Australia's 22 million people were born overseas. 46% of those people have at least one parent who was born overseas. Now, this is the reason why I formed Compel, to increase the representation of multicultural Australians in politics, because at present, we just merely have 4% of people from non-Anglo background who are representing us in politics, and that's just atrocious. So at Compel, we're a non-partisan organization, and we conduct workshops and hold events to encourage, educate, and assist multicultural Australians to learn about politics and how they can contribute to and participate in the political process. We envision a world where multicultural Australians are able to fully participate in the entire spectrum of political life and leadership, regardless of their citizenship status. Which brings me now to today's webinar. Warm welcome to Dr. Sukhmani Khorana. Dr. Sukhmani Khorana is a Vice-Chancellor's Senior Research Fellow at the University of Western Sydney. She has lots of experience in collaborating with community organizations on projects benefiting diverse communities. Dr. Khorana is a 1.5 generation Indian Australian. Dr. Khorana, that's how you describe it. So I'm gonna say it as you did, 1.5, with 15 years of teaching experience in universities across Adelaide, Brisbane, Wollongong, and Sydney. Her area of expertise is media and politics. So she is well trained in working with diverse communities, as well as understanding how the media and political class produce messages. She has so very kindly offered to help us tie our concerns to the relevant policies of the political parties, because at the end of the day, policies are so very important in this election, more so than the mere sound bites that you get off your television ads or news headlines, and you can't even read the news because you have to pay for it, and lots of us don't want to pay for news anymore. So we just look at a headline and we decide what the news is about, and very often it's not quite accurate. So here we are. So Dr. Khorana, without further ado, I'll let you take it away. Yeah.
All right. So I have to add a disclaimer, which is to say I'm not a policy expert. I have a broad-ranging interest in politics, and I've obviously I specialize in media, and I have also done projects which are about diversity in politics. I interviewed Indian Australian candidates at the 2019 New South Wales election, just to kind of understand what parties they were representing, what viewpoints they were standing for, and also get a sense of what was happening at the grassroots level in their seats and whether or not they were being adequately pre-selected by their parties. So that was published as a conversation article early this year, just before the election campaign started, and that's kind of sprouted a whole bunch of interest, along with other work that other people are doing in multicultural representation and politics. And I'm very happy that organizations like Compel and others are also doing that work in a non-partisan way. I guess when I say I describe myself as a 1.5 generation, because to some extent the issues and experiences of the first generation of migrants as well as the second generation of migrants kind of resonate with me. I am really deeply interested in representation, which is an issue which mostly second generation migrant Australians are enthused by. But I'm also kind of interested in, things which are first generation migrant issues, like, parent visas or cheaper childcare, for instance. But more broadly speaking, I think I empathize with a lot of multicultural voters, especially if you don't happen to be coming from a background where you know, studied in this country, or you've had any kind of civic education in this country. I just remember, you know, even though I studied politics in my Bachelor of Media degree at Adelaide Uni, I remember a friend who was a young Labour member coming up to me one day after my international politics class and saying, "Oh, do you know that the Liberal Party isn't really liberal?" And was completely shocking to me that that was actually a possibility.
A
And
lot
that
of
kind
people
of
still don't know that.
exactly, that kind of started me on this
Yeah,
journey of kind of
yeah.
trying to understand the political system here. And I obviously, you know, was armed with all the knowledge that I acquired during university. So I guess if you're doing a business degree here, or if you haven't been to university here at all, I can't even imagine what your starting point would be. You know, this is speaking specifically of people who come from multicultural backgrounds who migrate here. But then there's also the first-time voters who are just young voters, or people who've been here forever. But I discovered this morning when I was doing early voting in Western Sydney, people don't even know which seat they might be in. So I think there's a broader problem about civic education and political literacy, but obviously we're focusing on the kind of multicultural aspects of it, because I think it is important to address, you know, racial equity that tends to sometimes be cobbled together with gender equity. And I think there are intersectional approaches are important, but also it is important to highlight that racial equity is definitely, we're far behind in that. There was an article in The Guardian today, which I think Tarini and Compel also contributed to, which pretty much told us that 8% of the candidates this election are from a non-Anglo background, whereas I think the number of people we have, the percentage of people of non-Anglo background in the broader Australian population is closer to 30%. So that's a huge gap in representation still. And moreover, most of these people who are standing in these, most of the diverse candidates who are standing in this election are standing in seats which are safe seats for the other parties. So the chance of them actually making it to Parliament are pretty slim. And that's, you know, people from diverse backgrounds as well as people who happen to be women, let alone, you know, other kinds of gender diversity. So
And before we get into that, because there was a
uh-huh.
lot of information in the article, and I thought the way the data journalists did a fantastic job at dissecting even the professionals, you know, what profession they're from, you know, and which parties they sort of run in. So I thought that was interesting. But I want to back things up a little bit, because you shared with me earlier today that you've voted quite a number of times, but this was your first time voting in a heavily what do you call multicultural diverse electorate. Could you tell us what that experience was like, and how that was so different from all your other experiences of voting in non-diverse areas?
Yeah, mute myself. I've always kind of lived in inner cities and been in electorates which are kind of either Labour held or Greens held seats. So I guess at the polling booth, what I'm used to seeing is, you know, red and green in terms of the political advertising, but rarely any diversity. I remember once when I was voting at a polling booth in Tempe in inner West Sydney, and Osman Faruqi was the Greens candidate. He didn't win. It's a safe Labour seat, but I was just really surprised that someone who looked brown was a candidate in, you know, a seat that I was living in. But the experience today was really different, because this was, I voted at a polling booth in Blacktown. I don't live in the city of Green and in the federal seat of Greenway, but that was one of the closest polling booths to our place. And in addition to, obviously, there being multicultural candidates, not just in that seat, but in a number of neighboring seats, I noticed that they were mostly candidates of the Liberal Party, and they were mostly South Asian male who were kind of being represented. That was the kind of the bulk of the multicultural representation that I could see from the advertising. That was in Greenway, Chifley, and McMahon. There's 3 South Asian males standing in these seats as the Liberal Party candidates. And then there was obviously the contingents that were supporting them that were also young men, mostly of South Asian backgrounds, that were present there was also a Sikh man who was an independent in the seat of Greenway, and I don't know anything about his political background, but that was also something that I thought is worth investigating. So from basically, I've basically gone from like red and green, mostly kind of Anglo faces, to this kind of diversity, even though it's a kind of one-sided diversity. I'm sure that there's South Asian Greens candidates in other seats, but there was barely any kind of Greens representation in terms of advertising.
Is that a good thing or a bad? Is that a
booth.
good thing or a bad thing?
Oh, it's. I think it's neither. I think it's good to see multicultural faces, but it's also interesting that a certain kind of ideology, maybe business people, maybe first generation older South Asian, not by older, I mean not necessarily really old, but maybe over 40s, representing particular kinds of values and ideologies, is what is kind of getting a run in terms of political representation. But I have to also add that these are relatively safe Labour seats, so it's very unlikely that any of them are going to get into parliament. But I'm more interested in what is motivating these particular candidates to join the Liberal Party. And then for the Liberal Party, is it simply a box ticking exercise, or whether they're making genuine attempts to engage with the parties? And then obviously you can draw from that and think about why Labour is not doing the same, because we've had those contests in Fowler and Parramatta, particularly, where they've parachuted star candidates from the eastern suburbs. Why do they think it's not important to represent these communities in Western Sydney? And the Greens, I think, are obviously they've got younger voters. Their kind of primary demographic is the inner city, but I think maybe the Greens have a strategy about how they can also make inroads in these communities. I haven't seen those strategies, but I think I guess I'm just surprised that there is not much of a Greens presence in Western Sydney, even though their themes of social justice, environmental justice, I reckon would really resonate in some of these areas.
That's actually an interesting observation. That's something I hadn't picked up myself. And Meghna Bali, she's a reporter from the ABC, and she's here today. Hi, Meghna, as well. She recently wrote an article for the ABC talking about how politicians are vying for the Indian votes, right? And yet, like you said, you feel as though, or what you've observed is Liberal Party is actually making more of an effort to attract those votes, and not so much the Labour or the Greens. And do you have a sense why that is, or an inkling of why that could be? So coming back to what the latest article by the Guardian, they talked about the professions. Could that be a reason why? Like, for those who don't know, that the Guardian article, the data journalist actually broke it down even further by the kind of the candidates and the kind of professional backgrounds they do come from, and where and which party they tend to run for. And that's a sort of breakdown this data journalist has sort of done, which was, blew my mind. Do you have any thoughts on that? Why that is, and how that relates to Sorry, it's a big question.
I think so. There's two kinds of kind of engagement that the major political parties are doing with multicultural voters, especially first generation migrant voters. So both the Labour and Liberal parties are doing the kind of textbook engagement with migrant communities, which is sort of turning up at your temples and cultural institutions and donating money, or promising that they'll donate money to those kinds of institutions, being seen with leaders of particular kinds, sometimes controversially, with organizations that I guess are not necessarily representing broader communities. I think there's been pictures of both Albanese and Morrison wearing a particular Hindu scarf, and the Hindu Council of Australia has links with a particular organization in India, which is militant in nature. So there's all this kind of engagement, which is kind of questionable, but they still do it because that's just what they do with migrant communities. And then there's the other kind of level of representation, which I think is more meaningful, but I don't think first generation voters don't necessarily kind of really ask for that, though I think they're getting more savvy about it if they've been in the country for a period of time, which is substantive representation, which is give us a voice, by kind of, if there's sort of people in a particular community, help them get a member in the local council. And I think Parramatta Council is kind of doing well in that regard, and maybe it'll be reflected in the seat eventually, or give them kind of meaningful representation in office bearing roles in a political party, eventually mentor them to help get pre-selected if that's what they want to do. So that kind of meaningful representation, I think, is not really occurring. And that's where I think the Labour Party is falling behind the others. I'm not really sure what the reasons are.
Do you think the Liberal Party and the Greens are actually doing? Sorry, guys, we're talking about the major parties. Obviously, it's very hard to cover, all the parties, minor parties. We'd love to, but we're just keeping it to the major parties for now. You don't think that you think that Liberals?
I think the Liberals are not doing it in a meaningful way because they're sort of they're doing box ticking. They're, I guess, a little bit ahead of the Labour Party in that at least they're doing the box ticking, and the South Asian sort of men are standing in particular seats in Western Sydney, even though they might not win. I think it's a way for the Liberal Party to demonstrate they're engaged with the community, or at least engaged with a section of the community that sees itself as aspirational, as business oriented. So I think that's the message they're trying to send out, even though their seats are not really winnable as such by the Liberal Party. And the Greens, I guess, are probably, more representative of young people in general, including multicultural young people. So that's the broader landscape.
So I want to go start talking about the survey results and how that ties to policy. But just one more question before that. We've spoken extensively about the Indian population, Indian candidates. What about the Chinese Australian, candidates? I was actually, when I did this exercise of collecting data around, diverse candidates, I was actually really shocked that there were so few of them across the board. So what's going on there, given that we have such strong ties, whether at the moment, whether it's good or bad, we do have ties, economic ties with China. You'd think that there would be more Chinese Australian candidates running, but that's not the case. Do you have any thoughts on why that could be?
I reckon there's definitely a kind of Indian Australians are being foregrounded compared to Chinese Australians in this election cycle because of the relationship with China has obviously undergone extensive damage, the diplomatic relationship in the wake of COVID. And the impact of that has been that both parties don't want to be seen as kind of cozying up to China. If you kind of listen to the discourses around any of the national security debates and what's happening with the Solomons, no one wants to be seen as, siding with China. And that has a direct impact on how Chinese Australians are portrayed and how they're perceived and how they're represented, which also kind of means that a number of Chinese Australians I have colleagues who are working with Chinese Australians on various projects, and people are kind of reluctant to kind of put their hand up. This is the first generation and maybe slightly different in the second generation. People are just reluctant to really be kind of out there and politicized for fear of what impact it might have on their personal lives, or if they still have ties with China. So it's been really unfortunate, actually. I mean, we do still have a few high-profile ones. Gladys Liu, who's in Victoria, who's high-profile probably for the wrong reasons, and Sally Situ in the seat of Reid in Sydney, who is now part of a really interesting contest with Fiona Martin, who I guess everyone now knows couldn't even kind of tell one Asian Australian apart from another. So I'm just really hoping that she can fly the flag for Chinese Australians, and hopefully it leads to greater representation in the subsequent election cycles.
Fantastic. I think, we can talk on this topic for hours, right? But everyone's here to talk about their concerns and how that ties to policy. And that's something that I'm not good at. That's why we've got you today. So you've obviously seen some of the results that have come in through the survey that we put out last week. So do you want to start talking about what you've seen in terms of what concerns multicultural Australians overall, and even if it doesn't even differ from your non-Anglo with your Anglo-Australian concerns, is there any difference? Yeah,
that's interesting. I think many of the concerns that have come up in our survey results are the usual suspects, really: cost of living, climate change, the treatment of women. Some have mentioned things like the First Nations voice in Parliament and the treatment of refugees, and as well as immigration and visa issues. So I don't think it differs greatly or vastly from the vast majority of the Australian population. I would say that issues of immigration, treatment of refugees, First Nations voice in Parliament, those are probably issues that don't come up a lot in if you look at surveys of the broader Australian population. So that might be particular to this demographic, but the rest is largely about everyday life challenges which multicultural Australians share with the rest of Australia. So
yeah. Sorry,
go
go
on,
ahead.
Tarini.
Go ahead. Yeah. So shall we start talking about, let's say cost of living, and if somebody wants to say, okay, that's a concern of mine, everything's going expensive, I can't afford a house, I can't, when they want to think about, okay, which party is best served to solve that problem, where do they start and what do they look at?
So do you want me to talk about how cost of living to begin with, or?
Yeah, absolutely.
I've basically done, kind of very basic research into what the policies are. And a cost of living is one where in the latest federal budget, the coalition has thrown money at people, basically said these are $250 if you meet these criteria. So it's given handouts. But many economists have looked at that and said that that's not going to be adequate. So if you look at a cost of living associated issue like housing affordability, both of the parties have come up with policies to tackle that, but it's actually a very complex issue because you need to increase supply. And both parties also are interested in maintaining house prices to some extent, because unless 2/3 of Australia, which already owns houses, unless their house prices go up a bit over time, there's not going to be consumer confidence, and the economy is not going to grow. So it's actually a very, very complex problem. And if anyone says that they're going to solve the housing affordability crisis, I think that they're probably making it up. What I think is required is getting experts on the table, but the approach by both parties is a little bit piecemeal on this. So you can probably compare the two and look at which one's better. Both have got kind of schemes. The coalition has got a scheme where they can call someone who qualifies, and by qualification they have to either be a low or a moderate income earner. And there's about, I think, 50,000 places a year. So there's a lot of competition. So basically you only need a 5% deposit and the government will help you buy a house, but you will pay them off over time with your equity. And with the labor scheme, it's something similar, but you need a 2% deposit and you have to have additional criteria to qualify. And they've also the difference is they've also sort of committed a little bit more money to build social housing. And the Greens, I guess, have promised that they'd do those kinds of things, but they'd raise the number of people who are eligible to 125,000 a year, and also have certain kinds of professions on the list, your regular kind of essential workers like teachers and nurses and cleaners, so that they can live close to where they work, which is a big problem, I guess, in places like Sydney and Melbourne at the moment. So those are the kind of broadly the policies on offer. And I think economists are not kind of putting anyone ahead of any other party at the moment, but there's slight differences in terms of, there's been, the 5 versus 2% between Liberal and Labor and Labour offering social housing, more kind of funding for social housing compared to the coalition. So that's, did you want me to address another issue or keep going?
Just, when people say cost of living, and I've seen a lot of respondents, do you think they're just specifically talking about being able to buy a house, or are there other cost of living pressures?
It's interesting, this election cost of living as a phrase has really come up compared to any other election cycle that I've been part of in Australia. And I reckon it's like, it's in response to the inflation that we've experienced in the last few months. So it's definitely like reactive, and people are sort of reacting to the increase in petrol prices, the increase in grocery prices, a lot of which is to do with global conditions, and partly to do with the floods in New South Wales and Queensland, which led to kind of certain kinds of agricultural products becoming less available. So that's what people are talking about, but I'm not sure that either party can really address those issues because they're just circumstantial. So, but I think housing affordability is always a big part of cost of living. And so I think that's what the parties are trying to address when they talk about cost of living.
So, but let's suppose you don't want to buy a house, you're a renter, and then there are renters that are complaining that rentals becoming unaffordable as well.
Yeah. So I should also add that neither party has said anything on how to assist renters. The Greens do have something about renters. They've said that they'll make sure that renters have more rights, and I think they also want to change the clause about evicting renters without any notice. So the Greens is the only party that I've seen of the three major parties, I guess if you include Greens in that have said anything about renters at all.
And I think that's really important, because I think buying a house for so many, it's just such a long-term dream that at the moment, you've got to live with what you've got. And if you're renting, and if that's really expensive, then that does make life really hard. And I'm actually surprised that neither of the large parties have actually even. Okay, I'm not so surprised that Liberals haven't, but I'm surprised that Labor hasn't even gone anywhere near the issue to speak about it. So it's good to know that they haven't got any.
With housing affordability, Labor has said that they will, sort of give, preference in the kind of places that they have available for this help out scheme. They will consider the needs of single women and people fleeing domestic violence, but that hasn't become, I haven't seen anything being said specifically about people who are renting.
Got it. I think you mentioned, one of the things about cost of living is that things that are beyond the control of any political party to do anything about, like wars that are happening, externally. But then you talked about floods, which then brings me to the other thing that concerns multicultural Australians. And interestingly, the word on the street, when I do talk to, some white Australians, they seem to think that multicultural Australians don't really care about climate change. But that wasn't true, was it? Because that came up as one of the concerns in the survey results, that they do care about it.
Yes, I think there's this broader perception, and I come across this in my research as well, that migrants are the people who produce urban congestion and produce problems in the environment, right? As opposed to, the vast majority of Australians, the regional Australia is sort of, this place where they're really concerned about the environment, and rightfully so. And middle class Australia is the place where they want to protect the environment through certain kinds of practices. So migrants are these people who live in places which usually have not the best infrastructure, so yet these are the people that contribute to urban congestion. And so I think there's a real kind of problem here where the thinking about migrants needs to shift, because they do actually contribute to conserving resources and obviously contribute to the economy. And they're concerned with climate change. In fact, migrants live in areas, I can speak about Western Sydney, which are going to suffer from the worst impacts of climate change, whether it's the, Western Sydney, vast majority of it is a floodplain. When there is urban heat, it's worse in Western Sydney, and any new housing which is being built needs to kind of keep those kinds of considerations in mind. But that is not always taking place because of the lobby groups of developers seem to kind of overpower any of these considerations. So again, it's complex problems, but I'm not surprised that migrants are concerned about the environment, but I think that discourse hasn't kind of moved to the way political parties think about migrants, or the political discourse thinks about migrants.
Could it be that migrants talk about climate change with different words?
Yeah, potentially, I think. I think a lot of first-generation migrants, maybe they're seen as more concerned with economic social security, but they're also interested in houses that last a long time. So maybe they do think about it differently to the way we might think of as middle-class environmentalism. And in terms of the policies, I'm just going to share my screen to show you this article by from the ABC, which is scientists analyzing the major parties' targets for emissions. So the Labour Party has a net zero target by 2050, and 2030 it wants to be 43%. The Liberal Party 2030 is only 28%, so it's a little bit lower than the Labour Party target. The Greens policy is to have net zero by 2035, so it's way above the other parties, and transition away from coal and gas by 2030. The other major difference is that the Labour Party does have clearer strategies around electric vehicles, and the Liberal Party doesn't. So overall, the scientists do tend to rank Labour and the Greens a little bit better on the climate change policies than the coalition. But I think the overall kind of conclusion is that climate change as an issue has really been buried this election. So it is coming up as a big issue in any kind of radio program I listen to, especially by younger Australians, but not just by younger Australians. But it doesn't really seem to be something which the parties are trying to address. And that's for a whole range of political reasons that I think people are already aware of. So I'll just stop sharing this now.
I mean, you've obviously referenced the ABC, and we will shortly talk about. I'm wary of the time, so we'll shortly talk about media in a bit. The other concern that came up in the survey was obviously Indigenous, rights, and with regards to that, what are the policies in each of the parties? Who does better when it comes to the First Nations people?
So I really think we should defer to the expertise of Indigenous experts on the details of which party is doing better, and I think there's just so much more that needs to be done to really have a First Nations voice in Parliament. The major difference is that the Liberal Party doesn't want to make any changes to the Constitution. They simply want to have an Indigenous advisory body to incorporate that idea of a First Nations voice. Whereas Anthony Albanese and the Labour Party have committed to having constitutional changes to incorporate that First Nations voice. And I guess the Greens have got kind of more debate within their party about how it needs to occur. So they've got more detail on the ground about what is lacking there. They've got many candidates from Indigenous backgrounds, and there's that makes a difference as well to their level of involvement in Indigenous issues. But yeah, broadly speaking, that's the major difference between the two parties. One is with constitutional changes and one is without.
Well, thanks for that. And if anyone has any questions on any of these topics or concerns, please ask away. I do have one question from Joy. She says, as a multicultural mental health advocate, my interest is to understand which parties are truly vested in our communities and changing the delivery of services to improve and encourage participation.
I haven't followed, again, every single detail about mental health and multicultural mental health. I think broadly speaking, mental health, the Labour Party has come out with more policies around kind of in those emergency clinics and having nurses in those clinics. I haven't seen anything comparable from the Liberals so far. And this obviously includes addressing mental health as well. But as far as multicultural mental health is concerned, that's a really important topic, I think, personally. But I haven't seen it addressed at all in the pitch to multicultural communities. I think sometimes our leaders need to be advocates for multicultural Australia, but often they're just quoting multicultural Australia on the basis of the stereotypes that they perceive. I saw one particular party leader saying that they were going to have, one particular candidate said they're going to have a vibrant precinct in Harris Park, which is kind of Little India now, by having certain kinds of street lighting and so on, and just making the precinct more vibrant. And I thought that's a great idea, and what about having a community center there for domestic violence survivors? What about problems that actually exist in the community, and being advocates for those problems, and not just kind of trying to appeal to what they think the community will be voting on the basis of. And I think the leaders from these communities also need to play a role in being intermediaries and kind of conveying these major issues to the parties. So to answer your question, I haven't seen much, but I think advocates like yourself and community leaders need to work together to bring this issue to the notice of the major parties.
And also there's also the language aspect to providing mental health services as well, isn't it? It's not just, it needs to be culturally appropriate, and you also need to have practitioners who are diverse within that that space in order to cater to the diverse communities. And yeah, you're right. I actually haven't seen too much being spoken about that. But then I suppose they've not seen that as something that is overwhelmingly a large issue amongst Australians. I don't know why. I think mental health is so important. And thank you, Joy, for bringing it up, because that for me, that wasn't front and center as I even came to this event talking about mental health. But yes, this is very important, and that's something we will pay attention to and focus on as one of the things that's missing from the entire discourse of this election. Now, does anyone else have any questions? Someone has asked, curious to know how many people here watched the leader debates. I know I did. I don't know why I did, but I did. I just felt like I needed to be part of, I don't know, just have something to talk about, but I didn't think it affected my sense of where my ideas and my votes, like nothing changed my mind through that debate. So, okay, we do have a policy question from Democracy in Colour. They say, we would love to hear more about what commitments are being made for people on temporary visas with no voting power, but many of whom who are part of our community. Such an important question. And that was a big reason why I try to encourage people, even without voting rights, to come participate in this event, because yeah, we really need to hear your voices. Yeah.
So very quickly, I think from what I'm aware of, Labor has announced that they'll have immigration reform. And one big part of the immigration reform agenda in this coming cycle, if they get elected, is to make it easier for people on short-term visas to have permanent residency. Again, I haven't seen the detail yet, but that's what they're promising. Yeah, that's probably what's distinguishing them from the coalition so far. The coalition has and Labor have both said they'll announce more immigration-related policies in the lead up to the election. So whatever will happen will probably happen in the coming few days. But so far, Labor wants to convert more people from short-term visas to permanent residency.
And what about the Greens in this matter?
I haven't kind of looked at the Greens policy on this, so I'm not aware of anything.
That's fine. So
I mean, the way the Greens do stand out compared to obviously Labor, and Liberal is on temporary protection and the treatment of asylum seekers, where they advocate the closing of detention centers completely and no more offshore processing, whereas obviously the major parties still want to continue with that in some shape or form.
Okay, great. Thank you. And someone has asked, thanks for the great conversation. Do you have a comment on One Nation fielding people of color candidates? Oh, goodness.
Do you want to have a go at that, Tarini?
Oh, what? What do I have to say? I just think that, well, look, that's why I exist and Compel exists, because I think the biggest problem we have as multicultural Australians is that so many of us don't understand the political system. We come in as voters. We come into the country not understanding the political system. We stay here for 10, 15 years, and it's a migrant journey, and then you get your citizenship, and then suddenly you've got to vote, and then suddenly you're trying to figure it all out, and you listen to what your friends tell you or relatives tell you, and then you cast your vote. And it's no different with candidates running as political candidates. It's the same story. They don't know either. And I haven't spoken to any one of the One Nation candidates, but I have spoken to other aspiring political candidates who are members of political parties, looking forward to be pre-selected and potentially run in the future. And the overwhelming response that I've gotten from them was that they don't even know why they joined the party that they joined. They aren't able to give me an answer, and they aren't even able to talk to the policies that the parties that they've joined support and why they support it. They aren't. It's more of a community thing. My friends, support this party, so they must be good. So coming back to your question, why we have people of color candidates, we've also got candidates in the United Australia Party as well. Lots of them, mostly male. I reckon it's got to do with that. But of course, I'm not saying that to insult their intelligence. Probably, they may fully understand why they're joining the party, and maybe they don't believe that those parties are racist. I don't know how and what their personal experience with the party leadership has been, because sometimes that colors your vision, your view of things as well, your personal relationships. So I can't comment on that, but I think, but that's just my opinion. I'm not stating it as a matter of fact, and that's what that's how things are. I'm sorry, I don't have a better answer. We do have one more question. Deepak Joshi, you spoke about lack of representation of South Asians or Chinese candidates in winnable seats. I have not seen many candidates from these backgrounds emerge who could be seen as leaders by all communities. So rather than feel entitled, shouldn't aspiring leaders of Chinese or South Asian heritage get down to work to be seen as leaders for all Australians?
That's an interesting question, I think. So from all of the background research I've done in the US and the UK and Canada, I think what it shows you, if you looked at someone like, say, Sadiq Khan, who's the mayor of London, to be successful at that level, they do have to play the so-called ethnic card as well as the mainstream card. So Sadiq Khan doesn't just appeal to Muslim, people of Muslim background who happen to be British, but he also appeals to a lot of people in the inner city, younger, urban British people who might kind of value diversity as well. He's kind of widely recognized at particular kinds of very British events. So people who are successful as political candidates at that level, and sometimes it can be seen as a disadvantage because you have to walk that line quite carefully, do the ethnic representation as well as appeal to the mainstream. And most people think it's really difficult work to do. So I agree, but I do agree with you that if someone is serious about it and they want to kind of represent particular communities properly, as well as be aware of what the broader issues are. And sometimes I don't think they're all that different. They do have to have broader knowledge of Australian politics and other kinds of multicultural communities, as well as non-multicultural communities. I think that kind of broader knowledge is really valuable. I think that even if someone wanted to not represent a particular community, the way politics and media and other sectors work is that you embody that lived experience. So you will be called upon to do that. My research hasn't particularly been about South Asian or Indian Australians. I had a research project which was broadly about diversity in the media, but I often get called upon by South Asian and Indian Australian kinds of stories to just speak on that. And, I have to embrace it because I'm speaking to that as well as the broader diversity. So having both is important, but also not discounting that your lived experience might be representing a particular community needs to be taken into consideration, I reckon.
And certainly you hit on a really, important point here. And I know we're over time, but I'm just going to spend 3 minutes on media, because interestingly, I myself and also Deepak Joshi, who's attended the event from the Humanism Project, we actually went and did an impromptu interview with Gladys Liu. And, she really expressed her frustration, with regards to why the focus is always on the fact that she's Chinese. Why that, there's more to me. I don't just, do things for Chinese people. I do things for everyone, from people from different communities. Why is it that, nobody wants to talk about that? Why do they only focus on one aspect of me? And interestingly, I went and looked back at a lot of those interviews or she has done, or even the questions she gets fielded from interviewers from media organizations. It's always has to do with her race and China. That's been their laser focus.
That would be frustrating. Yeah, that would be frustrating.
If that's the box that they put you in, then how do you then break out of that box when media is controlling the narrative?
That's why we need to have more than one, so that the burden of representation doesn't fall on the token one who exists. If you need more than one media, you need more than one person of color in the media, and you need more than one person of color in parliament. So that you begin to see, that person is more than just representing their community, although they're also attempting to do that.
So if you could really quickly talk about media in the space and how to discern, you obviously have different media organizations favoring, whether they are right-leaning or left-leaning. So how do multicultural Australians, with their concerns, and now you've helped them tie them to the different policies of these political parties, but then you've got media outlets bombarding them with constant information that may or may not actually accurately reflect the reality of what the party's policies are. And, how do you then break through that misinformation?
That actually requires, months and months. I mean, I usually see that happen with my students in media classes, where they have that kind of moment of, when you compare a 7 News clip with an ABC News clip, that's the difference. That's how the framing of the same story can make a difference to how you make meaning. So I think it just requires a lot of work and training, and we now have the added layer of misinformation that's provided by social media and fake news. So it's actually very complex for everyone, let alone for multicultural communities, where there might be added disadvantage of, again, not being exposed to the political economy of various media organizations in this country, not understanding what a public broadcaster does necessarily compared to commercial networks, and also kind of just generally, might not have English as a first language. So there's a lot of barriers. But what I have managed to do with a number of people who, I guess, without sort of telling them this is the media you should look at, is point to them to the ABC Vote Compass. And that often gets them started on the journey where they start looking at ABC News stories more, and understanding that, a public broadcaster is different from a network or a paper which is owned by someone who's doing it for profit. So I guess just maybe making a suggestion along those lines is helpful, rather than trying to combat the whole problem, which is really big and complex.
So perhaps the way to combat this is to have community organizations, and there are plenty of representatives today that have attended this webinar, to not just talk about politics, but also talk about media in tandem, because they sort of work hand in hand to deliver the results that we were all experiencing, the government that gets elected, and then the impact that the decisions or the policies that they create then has an impact on us. So we can't, at the moment, we can't seem to separate. We can't just talk about politics in isolation without talking about the impact or the stories that media organizations say, and being very aware of which media organization, where their leanings are, and then to consume that information with that lens.
Yeah.
And I think that's, if there's one message we can give out to community organizations today and representatives, is to talk a lot more about media as well, because as we know,
and use the power of social media. I always sort of thought of social media, having kinds of conversations on social media that are disruptive or that can be interventionist is almost impossible unless you have a huge following or you're an influencer. But I had a recent experience in the representation of the Indian Australian community where a particular journalist from a mainstream media organization I thought misrepresented the community despite me doing an interview with them. I tweeted about it in a respectful way, in addition to having a respectful personal conversation with the journalist. And it did lead to other kinds of organizations picking up that issue in a way that I thought was better than this particular organization had done. So I think if you disagree with something, there are ways of kind of talking back to power, especially the representation of migrant communities, because often many of these organizations don't have those community insiders within their organizations who can help them understand what the various nuances are. It's improving, and of course there's people in this audience who've done a great job with that, but they're still making huge mistakes. The decision makers are still people who are not people of color, so we do have a long way to go, but I think we should keep kind of trying to have those persuasive conversations that change that representation, which also hopefully addresses Noel's question there in the chat.
Yeah, Noel is actually from the African Australian Advocacy Center, and they've done their own survey within the African community. So I was actually quite interested in having him share what their concerns are. So Noel, if you, I go up. Oh, he has typed in a question. So he talks about how do we really reduce instances of discrimination, stigma against refugee and migrant communities in the media. Yeah, I think that you've pretty much answered that question. Is there anyone else with any last questions that you would like Dr. Khorana to answer? This is your chance, because we have 1 week left for the elections. I mean, I'm not saying this is your only chance. You can obviously reach out to us by email or social media to ask follow-up questions as well. Yeah, looks like we don't have any more questions. Thank you so much, Dr. Khorana. Like, I really enjoyed this session. I actually learned a lot. And, you know, what a great way to end this event, because, you know, you said we need to speak up, you know, in a powerful way to these media organizations. And I think that is something we need to learn, learn how to do. And perhaps there's more work for us in this space, you know, another webinar. How do we do that? We'd absolutely love to learn from you. Thank you everyone for joining us, and a special shout out to community organization representatives. You know, like I mentioned before, Democracy in Color, Australian Advocacy Center, the Humanism Project, and NRI Affairs, amongst many others. And Walter Villagodzelo is a leader in the Filipino community, past counselor, and he's done a lot of work in the refugee communities. Yeah. So if I've missed anyone, and yes, Kat Hanaway from Politics in Color as well, and Licia Heath from Women for Election. Thank you for, I mean, these are all community leaders, and what they've learned in this webinar, I'm sure they would be, you know, passing it on to their members as well. And of course, thank you so much, Dr. Khorana. Really enjoyed this webinar, and I appreciate you helping us navigate this federal election.